the major piece of news was that yesterday, we're recording this on Tuesday, the 24th, was the UN Climate Action Summit. And I think the best way to summarize it is the way that Vox put it, which is they called it a, quote, disappointment, and complained that the countries responsible for the largest share of emissions, that's carbon emissions, remained reluctant to sign on tougher climate targets, which is a little bit ridiculous because, as Vox says in a major understatement, quote, many countries are struggling to meet their already weak targets and global greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. So, complaining that they're not setting more, quote, ambitious targets when they're not even coming close to meeting their targets already. I mean, it's just illustrative of the whole goal here is not to actually solve a problem, but to basically pat yourselves on the back for agreeing to pretend to solve the problem. And then the question is, well, why aren't they doing it? If you have all of these countries that are so committed to, quote, reducing their emissions, that they've signed on to these agreements, and why is that not happening? And, I don't think the answer is going to be a big surprise to listeners of this show, but it's essentially that most countries are not willing to commit suicide. Very rich countries are, willing to make some amount of sacrifices, not enough to actually do anything about overall emissions trends, but enough to make life worse for their citizens. And, there is the potential of people making catastrophically bad decisions. But on the whole, most countries recognize that they need energy. And despite what we're told by the media and by, all of these different alleged thought leaders, you can't replace fossil fuels by wind and solar in any significant scalable way. And so countries have not done that. And to the extent that they've tried to, then, they've seen higher prices and a lousier grid. And so it's not at all surprising that we are where we are. And it's, the question is are we moving in the direction of acknowledging that and really taking seriously that fossil fuels are indispensable to human flourishing? And of course, the answer is no. We're actually headed in the other direction. And the actual big story of the UN Climate Action Summit was not anything the UN did or any action that anybody took on climate. It was really the speech, if you can call it that, from 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Now, some of you asked me about our take on her UN tirade, and frankly, I did not really want to talk about it. Not because I don't think, oh, well, you're 16, you can't have an informed, thoughtful views, or that you can't criticize the 16-year-old's views. I was 16 once. I was pretty precocious, and, I did not have the forum that she did. But, I think, it's only because of fossil-fueled civilization that 16 is even considered a child. 200 years ago, that is, you are definitely an adult. And if she wants to have a national platform, or international platform rather, then I think it's fine to engage. But the reason I didn't really want to go into this is I will argue with a 16-year-old's arguments the way I would with any adults. But I'm not going to mock a 16-year-old. And there's actually not a lot else you can do with her statement, because it's not an intellectual statement. It's not a statement appealing to anybody's mind. It is empty and empty moralizing. And that's probably even too kind to put, a phrase to put on it. It's basically yelling and crying. And, that's why the people who like it, because they're sympathetic to it. And the people who don't. But I was thinking about it and I said, well, there's one point I haven't seen made that I think is worth making. And, Thunberg's basic claim is that we should listen to the scientists. So last Wednesday, she addressed a congressional committee and said, I want you to listen to the scientists and I want you to unite behind the science, and then I want you to take real action. Now, generally when people say that, what they mean is that like you have to accept the IPCC's claims at face value. And as we pointed out on this show and throughout our work, no, you shouldn't just take them at face value. Like, it's science. Everything is open to question and needs to be questioned. But even if you did take the IPCC at face value, there is nothing remotely like the situation Thunberg is describing. So what she describes is in her rant yesterday was, she said, people are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. I mean, there is nothing in the IPCC that I've seen, and Steffen, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that remotely justifies this. Like, it finds, from what I've seen, it's the IPCC says that you can't make definitive claims, or it does not find evidence, rather, that floods, droughts, hurricanes are increasing, that it is resistant to the idea that we can, definitively tie extreme weather to human activity. And, if you look at what is going to be the economic impact of climate change, it's not that the planet becomes uninhabitable, but it's that, GDP will go down a little bit from what it would otherwise be, which is far many times what it is today, in 100 years, if we did nothing to address or adapt to climate. So the idea that, like, listening to the scientists, even if you listen to them blindly, would lead to anything like what she and the people who support her advocate, I think is just, it's crazy. And another way to put the point is, what we're seeing here is a real opportunity to take the scientific high ground. Because one of the mistakes is just to like say, oh, climate change is a hoax or a lie. Like, you want to think about it really precisely, which is you have CO2 as a byproduct of using fossil fuels, and you want to know what is the impact that it has on the climate. And then you can debate the magnitude, you can debate how that impacts human flourishing, and then you can debate what to do about it. And, there is a credible range of different views, from, CO2 is a pretty minor influence to the one that the IPCC holds, that, it's a real problem that we have to contend with over the 100 years. But I think what's not at all credible and not at all scientific is the view that the world's going to end in 12 years and that, this is a complete collapse of civilization. And certainly there's nothing, the science tells us, that can even begin to justify Thunberg's monstrous genocidal ideas of opposing economic growth and stopping our use of fossil fuels. She said explicitly, all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? No, how dare you? When there's billions of people who don't have anywhere close to our standard of living. And when you think about, if somebody had that view 100 years ago, how much poverty and suffering and death you subject people to. If you're against economic growth, you are against human beings living and flourishing. And you are calling for mass extinction of human beings. And that is definitely something that, there is not 1 ounce of science to justify. And the fact that somebody can hold such a view and be seen as a moral inspiration really speaks to how deeply indoctrinated all of us, not just children, have become in this green ideal of non-impact. And I'll just end on this. I think my favorite response to Thunberg came from a satirical publication, The Derringer. And the headline was, "Experts agree restructuring world economy, best way to treat child's anxiety," which I think just about sums it up. Steffen, any thoughts on Thunberg or on the climate summit as a whole?
Yeah, so regarding the IPCC, it's typically the case that in their reports they are much more nuanced, of course, and they talk about something like confidence or agreement, summarizing the literature. So, in a sense, the IPCC reports themselves are unscientifically formulated, and certainly the policy, the summary for policymakers. But they acknowledge that the noise level in the data is so large regarding any kind of climate variable that usually you can't really find real trends or attribute this to any human impact. So, but I want to use it as to make a larger point, which is it's typically the case with these advocates that they establish the IPCC as sort of the authority on the science. And then because they know that almost nobody reads these reports, they can then just claim whatever they want. So they typically do something like, oh yeah, this is the IPCC, and the IPCC says, oh yeah, this is all human warming or anthropogenic warming since the 1950s or something. They have high confidence in that, and then they talk a little bit about the details of that, and then they go on and say, and then there's this study X from institution Y, and it predicts this crazy sea level rise in the year 2080 and beyond. And this is not like the IPCC position, and not what the IPCC would project in any kind of CO2 emission scenario, but then they just connect this in a way as if this was the same as a mainstream IPCC position. So that you have to realize that this is a sort of propaganda tactic where they establish everything they say as IPCC authoritative science, and that's highly questionable. But then they just go on to add their own stuff. And then with politicians and layman advocates, you get something even more extreme, like Thunberg said, something like a mass extinction event and so on. So this is like nonsense. This is just made up. So there are speculations about what a future scenario would mean of like 2 or 3 degrees of warming, what this would do to corals or other species and so on. But this is not the equivalent of just hysterically screaming the world will end and all life of it will be impossible. This is totally made up, of course. But this is very common. This is not like, oh, Greta Thunberg just introduced that new tactic. This is going on for years now with advocates.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Just about the dynamic of how the IPCC becomes a springboard for any sort of scare scenario that any person cooks up, and of course anybody who says something milder, that just gets discounted as like a crank denial theory rather than the crank alarmist theory.